So welcome everyone to the 2021 UMN Conservation Sciences Spring Seminar Series. So this will be our last seminar for the spring semester. So thank you to everyone who's joined us along the way. So before I introduce today's speaker, just a couple housekeeping items. So we will ask that if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat, or at the end of Ellen's talk, feel free to unmute, be brave, and ask your question directly. So without further ado, it's been my pleasure to work with Dr. Ellen Brandell over the last 3 years in Yellowstone and see a lot of her work really take off, and now see her kind of extend on to her postdoctoral work at University of Wisconsin-Madison. So Dr. Ellen Brandell is a wildlife disease ecologist. She earned her PhD from Penn State in 2020, where she studied the infectious diseases of gray wolves in Yellowstone National Park. So Ellen is now a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where she researches the potential for chronic wasting disease management through hunting. Ellen is also a conservationist and outdoor advocate. So Ellen, without further ado, I'll pass the screen over to you.
Okay, awesome. Thanks for that introduction, Jack. And thanks everybody for coming. I'm excited to talk to you guys today about the challenges of chronic wasting disease, and in particular, predicting the effects of predators on creating healthier cervid herds in the greater Yellowstone. So of course, first I want to thank all of my co-authors and collaborators on this work: Peter Hudson, Paul Cross, Nathan Galloway, Doug Smith, Dan Staler, John Trainer, Dan McNulty, Will Rogers, and I also want to thank Matt Metz and PJ White. And I want to thank you guys in advance for not taking any screenshots or distributing any of the results slides, because this is work that is currently in review. Okay, so we'll start off with some background on chronic wasting disease. I'm sure most of you have a little bit of understanding, but just so that we're all on the same page. So chronic wasting disease, or CWD, is a pathogenic prion that affects the deer family, or cervids. So this includes deer, elk, and moose. You'll hear me say just deer often probably in this talk, but I'm really just encompassing the deer family when I say deer. A prion is a naturally occurring protein that primarily occurs in the central nervous system. And the prion becomes diseased when it becomes misfolded, as you can see up here. And these misfolded prions are the infectious agent causing chronic wasting disease. Chronic wasting disease is directly transmitted between individuals through things like saliva and blood, and also indirectly transmitted from the environment. And this often occurs when deer ingest soil or plants that have infected feces or urine on them. Hosts are asymptomatic for 1 to 3 years on average, and they are infectious at low levels over much of that period. And this is really one of the big problems with chronic wasting disease, is that we can't detect individuals when they are probably infectious. And then hosts become more infectious when they become symptomatic, and this occurs in the terminal stages of the infection. And this is when hosts might lose coordination, drool, become emaciated or despondent, and even sometimes there are behavioral changes like losing their fear of people. And CWD is always fatal to its hosts. So CWD has been spreading in North America since at least the 1960s. And as you can see from these maps, there's been a really drastic increase in the distribution of chronic wasting disease, particularly in the last decade. So starting in about 2000, it was mostly just detected in Colorado and the surrounding area. And then we see some pretty rapid expansion between 2012 and 2021. So this is really a large-scale wildlife disease problem. CWD now occurs in over 26 states. Okay, so how have we been managing chronic wasting disease, if at all? Well, CWD has never been eradicated once it has been established in an area. New York State actually claims to have eradicated chronic wasting disease. It probably wasn't established in the area at this time, but they detected CWD in a captive deer facility in 2005, and they removed all deer from that facility and an additional facility as well, and have not detected CWD in the state since then. So that's really kind of the only success story that we have with chronic wasting disease. But like I mentioned, once it becomes established in a host population, it has not been eradicated. Growth of CWD prevalence is slow in about the first decade following that detection, and then it tends to speed up through time. And human management, we've done a few things to try to manage chronic wasting disease in these deer and elk populations. Number one is reducing host density, and this is typically done by harvest and increasing harvest management regulations in all these different states. The second is by changing regulations such as reducing feeding or baiting and increasing hunting tags in these CWD positive zones. And then less common is a testing call method where individuals are captured, they're tested for chronic wasting disease, and then if they are positive, they are removed. And in some cases, there's been a full call. So that is, like I mentioned, in New York State at that captive deer facility. And then importantly, there's no vaccine and there's no treatment for chronic wasting disease. So those are not management options at this time. So managing chronic wasting disease has really, it's really been a challenge, to say the least. And we think that hunting probably has some force on the landscape, but in general, I think it's safe to say that hunting has not been very effective at substantially reducing or removing chronic wasting disease. And predators continue to be proposed as a control mechanism for chronic wasting disease. And this is quite different from the human-based approaches that I just mentioned. And this is particularly pertinent at the moment because the distribution of CWD-infected cervids and abundant predators are now overlapping in numerous areas. And so this is what we're going to be exploring today. How would predators reduce chronic wasting disease? Well, this is a concept that's been coined the healthy herds hypothesis. And that's because it's this idea that predators can create healthier cervid herds when they preferentially remove infected prey from a population. And theoretically, the healthy herds hypothesis is very plausible. Many studies, modeling studies, have shown evidence of the healthy herds hypothesis, even based in empirical research. However, empirically, so actually looking at field data, there aren't many systems that have shown evidence for the healthy herds hypothesis. There are many studies that have found that predators prefer prey in worse body condition and even infected prey, but few studies have linked that to the actual health of the entire prey population. Red grouse and plankton systems are some that have shown evidence for the healthy herds hypothesis. Okay, so what are the mechanisms that would allow predators to actually be removing enough infected individuals to create a healthier herd? Well, one would be to manipulate the infected population. So that could be done a few different ways. Two examples are shortening the lifespan of infected individuals, right? And this would occur by selectively killing them. And that would reduce the duration of infectiousness and therefore reduce future transmission potential. Within that, predators could be removing the most infectious, which in the case of chronic wasting disease is also the most symptomatic prey. And so this is kind of like a quarantine effect. And so those that are most vulnerable to predation might also be the most infectious. And therefore, by removing them, we're removing transmission rate. Okay, so I can show you a quick diagram of that. So let's say we have a group of deer and one of them here in the red is infected with chronic wasting disease. Predators come in on the landscape, they cue in on that infection by vulnerabilities and symptoms that those hosts are then displaying from the disease. And we're left with a group of deer then that maybe we're not transmitted to because that transmission, or I should say the predators killed that individual before transmission events could take place. So this would be one way that the healthy herds hypothesis could come to fruition. Another would be to manipulate the susceptible population. And this could also be done a few different ways, such as decreasing the size of the prey population just in general. And this may reduce the number of potential infectious contacts. So what I mean is that with fewer individuals in a population, the probability of an infected individual coming into contact with a susceptible individual could be lower. Additionally, predators on the landscape may change prey behavior in ways that decreases transmission potential. I'm not really going to touch on this today. So as an example, let's say we have a group of deer and some of them are infected with chronic wasting disease. And when predators come in, they are simply reducing the density of this prey population without respect to infection status. And so when there are fewer individuals, we might expect that there's fewer contacts between susceptibles and infected. And this mechanism would be particularly important if a disease is transmitted in a density dependent manner, right? So we have that transmission scaling with density. However, we believe that chronic wasting disease transmission is considered to be primarily frequency dependent. So what do I mean by that? Well, if we have a deer, it might only be contacting individuals within its own social group. And so no matter the density of the entire deer population, this deer is only going to contact deer within its group. So what this means is that the contact rate between susceptible and infected individuals is not really scaling with density. So for this reason, we think that manipulating the infected population in the case of chronic wasting disease is going to be the best way that predators are going to be able to create healthier cervid herds. Okay, so how would we study this? Well, in a perfect world, we would be able to do experiments, right? Where we would have multiple sites, we would vary the timing of disease introduction, we'd vary predation pressure, and we'd track these effects through time. Obviously, that is impossible for many logistical and ethical reasons. And so we're going to have to rule out experiments in this case. So our next best option to study this would be to collect all data of interest. So that would be predation habits like kill rate, selection, CWD prevalence in the prey population according to demographics, and then time series of all of these. Okay, so this is great, but CWD management is really under a time constraint. So most states are implementing CWD management plans immediately following chronic wasting disease detection, or they even have a plan in place prior to detection. So we really need data in a timely manner, and this is impossible. Money, logistics, and also the slow nature of this disease. And so really we need to be able to make decisions now on what management should be while we're collecting data. So this brings us to modeling. Modeling, in complement with collecting as much data as possible, will allow us to explore the potential effects of disease and predation. Like I said, these effects are going to take decades to play out on the landscape. So this at least gives us a starting point. And that's what we did here. So my work takes place in the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem, or the GYE, which is shown here in the light green shading. The GYE is about 25,000 square miles or more. It includes parts of eastern Wyoming, southwest Montana, and eastern Idaho. And we're going to have a particular focus today on Yellowstone National Park, which is here in the dark green. The GYE is home to diverse and abundant predators, as you can see here. But we're really going to focus on cougars and on wolves because they are carnivores that primarily prey on deer and elk, which are the main hosts for chronic wasting disease. CWD is invading the Greater Yellowstone, with CWD positive elk and deer being first detected only in the past few years, since about 2018, in these approximate locations. So this system really provides the opportunity to better understand the role of predators as a potential biological control mechanism for chronic wasting disease. And not only that, but the GYE is unique in that it provides an opportunity to study the interactions between predators, prey, and CWD because this system is very well studied, and I'll get into more details on that. Okay, so I'm going to quickly walk you through our modeling framework. I am happy to answer more questions about this later, but I'm going to keep it fairly brief for now. So we constructed a CWD host predator matrix model. It's a single predator-prey system where we modeled CWD invasion. So our two systems of interest were a cougar deer system and a wolf elk system. For the CWD host component of the model, it was age and sex specific, where we actually allowed chronic wasting disease to progress. So it was able to go from stages 1 to 10 within an individual host. And we actually allowed early transmission rates to be less than late transmission rates. So what this means is that early in that infection, when a deer or elk became infected, they were transmitting at very low levels. And then in the terminal stages of their infection, that transmission rate increased. And this emulates what we observe in terms of symptoms of the host, as well as what we observe in prion shedding rates in laboratory experiments or controlled experiments. And all of our transmission was frequency dependent. For the host, the mortality sources included natural mortality, harvest, predators, and chronic wasting disease. We did not specifically model compensatory mortality for chronic wasting disease or predators, but it was based on density, and so it was somewhat compensatory, whereas harvest was considered additive mortality. For the predator component of the model, we imposed upper and lower bounds on the abundance of predators, but other than that, the predator population was dynamic. So we had a functional and a numerical response that allowed predator populations to fluctuate based on prey population size. And then predators removed their prey based on the age of their prey and the severity of their chronic wasting disease infection. So going through those 10 stages. The stars that I've added here denote ways that we've advanced previous CWD host predator models. And we know that these are really important components of both the disease and of predation. So we felt they were really important to be adding to the models. Okay, so we parameterized the models mostly based on empirical data from Yellowstone National Park. And in Yellowstone, we've been monitoring wolves for about 25 years and cougars for over 30 years. And we've been quantifying things like kill rate, preference, and their population dynamics. So what happens is Yellowstone National Park employees go out and they visit wolf and cougar kill sites, and they conduct investigations to determine the prey species, its age, sex, cause of death, and condition. So in this top photo, you can see this is a bull elk that was killed by wolves. And in the bottom photo, this is a deer that was killed by a cougar. So using information like this from the past 2 to 3 decades, we're calculating those predation habits, so kill rate and preference, like I mentioned. So I'm going to quickly summarize this as best I can, all this work, just to tell you the important parts for our model parameterization. So here is an example of what we know about wolf predation habits in Yellowstone National Park. So here on the x-axis, we are looking at the age distribution of female elk that were killed by wolves, and those are the histogram bars. And then in the black dots, we're looking at wolf-caused mortality, and in the white dots, we're looking at elk survival. So let's zoom in on the histogram and look at that first. So what you are noticing probably is that there's this peak in these older age classes. So wolves are really keying in and killing these older elk. And this is coinciding with the probability that a wolf is killing an elk, as well as elk survival rates. And so our takeaway from this figure is really just to show you that wolves are killing these older adult females. And what we also know about these adult females is that they tend to be in poor condition. So they have low body fat. And neonates are not shown here. So essentially newborn elk, which are also a very important part of their diet. And they are highly selective for neonates, but it's a pulsed resource. So in the summer months, they're going to have high selection for neonates. But in general, we can summarize wolf predation as keying in on these older individuals in poor condition. So wolves, very selective by condition of the prey. The neonates are very preferred. And then importantly for this, over 80% of their kills are elk, which is why we are modeling a wolf elk system here. Okay, and we're going to look at something similar now for cougars. So again, this is looking at the age distribution of cougar kills, but now we're looking at percent of the cougar diet here on the y-axis, separated into deer and elk. Okay, so what you can see right away is that the cougars tend to be killing these younger individuals, especially elk. So they're really queuing in on these calves and fawns, as well as adult deer. So again, to just kind of summarize what we need for the model parameterization, cougars tend to be more selective by body size than condition. That is not to say they're not selective by condition, but with respect to wolves, they are more selective by body size, as we can see here on these younger individuals and adult deer. And about half their diet is deer. And deer tend to be the primary host for chronic wasting disease, which is why we modeled a cougar deer system as well. Okay, so like I mentioned, we use this empirical data from Yellowstone to inform parameter values and our parameter space for predation. And then for chronic wasting disease, our transmission rates were informed by observed prevalence growth rates. So what I mean by that is that we parameterized it so that we were reaching 30% prevalence in the deer population and 20% prevalence in the elk population by year 20 in our simulation. Deer and elk are well studied in the GYE and in the Western United States. So we use this to inform our prey vital rates. And then importantly, all the scenarios I'm going to present today are within an observed or plausible predator and prey parameter space. Okay, so let's return to that healthy herds hypothesis and just kind of summarize what we know and what we might expect. So now we know that age class is a critical component of predation, that prey condition is a critical component of predation. And we know that prey condition worsens as chronic wasting disease progresses. And this is also when they're most infectious. And so that's a really key part of why we think that predation might have effects on chronic wasting disease. In this system, per capita kill rates are greater for cougars than wolves, and both occur at pretty high densities. So about 30 to 50 individuals per 1,000 square kilometers. And typically wolves occur at a slightly higher density. And like I mentioned, deer are the primary host for chronic wasting disease. So we might think that cougars might be quicker to respond to chronic wasting disease since a greater proportion of their diet is deer. Okay, so I'm going to take you through the components of the transmission and the predation models. And then I promise we'll be on to some fun stuff. So here we're looking at the late stage transmission model. So here's transmission rate and the CWD stages where 0 is healthy, so it's not on this plot, and then infected stages 1 through 10. So like I mentioned, our transmission rate is low in those early stages of the infection, and then it increases by a constant value in the terminal stages of their infection, coinciding with that onset of symptoms and that increase in shedding rates. This is our selection portion of the model. And so again, we're looking at CWD stage, but now starting with 0, meaning uninfected individuals, and the selection coefficient. So I'll tell you the exact definition of that in a moment, but for now, just think of it as how selective a predator is on this age and infection class. Juveniles are in orange, adults in blue, and senescent or old adults here in green. So as you can see, we have an exponential increase here on selection. So as that infection progresses, we see an increase at an increasing rate on that selection. And so let's take juveniles here for an example, and this value is 3. So the selection coefficient, what it means is that if there were equal abundance across all of these age and infection classes, uninfected juveniles would be selected at 3 times the rate of the others. And I'll be using that again in context, so it might make more sense then. Here's our predator functional response curve. So this is how kill rate changes with respect to prey abundance, and we use a type 3 curve for this. And here is our numerical response. So this is how predator abundance changed with prey abundance. And for this, we used a type 2 curve. We initialized the model with a stable age distribution in our prey population, at which point we added chronic wasting disease and predators. And then we ran the model for another 20 to 40 years. And from this, we tracked CWD prevalence and its trajectory, prey and predator abundances, and prey demographics, and then summarized the effects of this predation. Okay, so we're going to jump into some results. So here I'm going to present you with two scenarios, a high predation scenario and a low predation scenario. Okay, and in the high predation scenario, there are higher per capita kill rates, higher selection on infected individuals, and slightly higher predator population sizes. And I'll take you through how these different scenarios result in changes in predator, prey abundance, and chronic wasting disease prevalence. Okay, so we'll start with the predators. Again, our high predation scenario is the solid line here, and our low predation scenario is the dashed line. And on top, you're going to see the cougar deer system, and on bottom, you're going to see the wolf elk system. Okay, so what we notice is that at first there are some fluctuating dynamics for both systems, but we see the stabilization under both high predation and low predation by about year 20 or 30. Now we're going to add in and look at that prey population. And again, the solid line is the high predation scenario and the dashed line is the low predation scenario. So for deer, we see that there's a pretty dramatic decrease in total deer abundance that stabilizes under this high predation scenario. And we see something quite similar with the elk population as well. And so basically this is the effect of predators coming in and reducing the size of these populations. Then in the low predation scenario, we're seeing something quite different, where we see deer and elk populations actually increasing at first. And then at some point, that curve turns over and we see a decline in these populations. And this is happening because in these later years, once chronic wasting disease becomes more established, it is a more important source of mortality for these populations. And we're seeing this decline. And so we can see that now when we look at CWD prevalence through time. So in this low predation scenario, we see this increase of CWD prevalence through time. So predators are not able to overcome the effects of CWD, and that's what's causing the decline in the populations here. But then when we look at the high predation scenario, we actually see CWD is removed in maybe about a decade in both of these scenarios. So to summarize this, we're finding that predators can remove CWD under high predation pressure. That high predation pressure leads to lower host populations relatively quickly. And in the long term, CWD-induced declines might play a large role. So we're noticing this trade-off where we have lower CWD prevalence and lower prey abundance, or higher CWD prevalence and higher prey abundance, but this might only last for a period. Okay, so we're going to examine these trade-offs a little bit more closely, thinking of that healthy herds hypothesis again. And this time we have three scenarios. So we have chronic wasting disease with no predators here in the solid red line. We're going to have CWD with predators in the dashed red line, and no CWD, and we have predators in the dashed blue line, and looking at deer abundance and elk abundance through time. Okay, so we'll start by looking at this red line because it's that similar shape to what we just saw on the last plot. So here we have chronic wasting disease and no predators. And so we see an increase in the prey population for a time. And then once CWD becomes established, we see these pretty dramatic declines, especially for deer. So then we can compare this red solid line with the red dashed line. So this would be adding predators. And essentially we're seeing that volatility of what's happening without predators almost completely gone. So we're seeing this stabilization here of the populations, both deer and of elk. And we don't see this turbulent dynamics that we see from just having chronic wasting disease. And now let's compare that to having the blue line, which is having no chronic wasting disease, but there are predators in the system. And what's pretty interesting about this is that they're quite similar. So I'm gonna go over some of the reasons why we're seeing this and summarize. So in the scenarios with predators, we're seeing that chronic wasting disease has very little impact. So both of these dashed lines. And what I mean by that is that the initial population size and the population size at about year 30 are about equivalent, whether or not chronic wasting disease was present or was absent. And so what's interesting here is that the effects of predators and chronic wasting disease on the landscape might not be what people expect. It might not be very dramatic or very obvious if we're just looking at abundance, for example. We also are seeing that these dynamics are really slow. So the effects of CWD without predators is taking 10, 20, 30 years to play out in both of these species. And like I mentioned, it might be difficult to detect chronic wasting disease unless you're doing a lot of testing, if you're just able to track these populations when we're in these predator-rich environments. And this is why modeling and data collection together is really important. Okay, so let's explore some of the mechanisms behind predators controlling chronic wasting disease. And we're going to start by looking at selection for infected prey, in this case, elk. So the x-axis here are that selection coefficient, like I mentioned before. So what this means is that if abundance were equal between infected and uninfected elk, then wolves would be killing infected elk at 0, 5, 10, or 15 times the rate of that uninfected elk. And on the y-axis, we're going to be looking at maximum CWD prevalence. So this is the highest CWD prevalence obtained in a 20-year simulation, so over 20 years. And then uninfected elk abundance at that 20-year point. And again, we have high predation and low predation scenarios. Okay, so we're seeing that on this top plot, higher selection for infected individuals reduces prevalence, which is what we'd expect, like I mentioned, in those mechanisms of the healthy herds hypothesis. And this is happening to a greater extent under this high predation scenario. So we see this pretty drastic decline in maximum prevalence under high predation. And CWD is dropping below our initial conditions. So basically being eradicated at somewhere around 10 times the rate of selection for infected individuals compared to our uninfected individuals. We also see this reduction in CWD under low predation, but it is to a lesser extent. And again, if we look at our abundance, we are seeing the same kind of trade-off where we can have high predation reduces CWD, might even remove it, but we also have lower elk abundance. We might see this growth of the elk population because CWD is being diminished simultaneously. And then under low predation, CWD more slowly declines with high selection, but there is higher elk abundance. Another important mechanism that I touched on was selection by age class. And we find that this is actually very important for removing CWD as well. So predators in general are highly selective for juvenile prey. And so we're going to be using that as our reference age class to compare to. So this x-axis is interpreted the same way as before, where we're looking at selection, this time for infected adults, between 0 and 12 times that of uninfected juveniles that reference that preferred class for cougar, deer, and wolf elk systems. And then on the y-axis here, we're looking at the % reduction in outbreak size. So how much that entire CWD outbreak is reduced in a 20-year simulation, depending on selection by age class here. Okay, so as you can see, these are both declining at pretty fast rates initially, and then we see a slower reduction in outbreak size as we increase that selection for infected adults, maybe past about 6 times. So in summary for this, basically what we're seeing is that chronic wasting disease outbreaks can be dramatically reduced when infected adults are selected at a greater rate than healthy juveniles. So let's take an example here of of 3 times the rate. So if an infected adult is killed at 3 times the rate of an uninfected juvenile, when their abundance is equal, we see about a 75% reduction in the outbreak size for a cougar deer system and about a 50% reduction in a wolf elk system. So this is pretty important. And the mechanisms behind this is simply one fact that adults comprise the largest proportion of the population. So by removing them, you're just removing more individuals. But importantly, you're removing more infected individuals. So because chronic wasting disease is a chronic infection, it takes years for those symptoms to arise, like I mentioned. More adults tend to be infected than juveniles. And because of these two things, adults are responsible for the most transmission in a population. And so when predators are removing those infected adults, they're removing the most transmission potential from the population. So one thing that might come from this is a potential indicator for field monitoring. So like I mentioned, going out to those kill sites, recording everything about those carcasses, those prey that were killed. If we are seeing this switch from juveniles to adults, it could be an indicator that chronic wasting disease is making adults more vulnerable to predation and that predators are picking up on those cues and removing them at higher rates. Okay, so I just want to summarize the modeling portion of this talk now. So what we're finding is that predators are able to reduce CWD in prey populations under observed and plausible scenarios. We also see that predators must kill infected prey at about a 10 times greater rate than uninfected prey to really reduce prevalence. We're finding that about 30 predators per 1,000 square kilometers or more, with per capita kill rates of about 1.5 prey per month, are necessary to really reduce chronic wasting disease. Now, this is dynamic. So these predator numbers and their kill rates are fluctuating within the model, but this at least gives us some baseline, some ballpark estimate to be able to say, do we think predators would be able to have any impact at all? We also found that predators can control CWD while maintaining prey abundance, so able to maintain healthy herds without these dramatic reductions in prey population size. We know that prey age structure is a critical component of predation, and it influences the effects of predation on disease dynamics. And in particular, selection for infected adults had the largest dampening effects on chronic wasting disease. So from all of this, we might hypothesize that predators have a greater capacity to reduce chronic wasting disease than hunters in this system. We didn't test this, but this is something that it would be interesting to see how this is tested in the future. So if you'll recall from the beginning, I said that human interventions and human management have not been very effective for removing or drastically reducing chronic wasting disease in most situations. In general, hunters are not very selective for CWD infected deer and elk. So really any increase in the preference for these infected prey by predators could be better than human removal. And this is something we could hypothesize from this work. Okay, so it's a model. There are a lot of simplifications, caveats, and intricacies that I'm just going to touch on briefly. It's not a spatial model. We know that spatial spread, dispersal events, these sorts of things are very important. And so that's something that could be added in the future. We don't know a lot about CWD transmission rates and prion shedding rates in wild cervids. And if these rates were drastically different than what we have in the model, it could have important effects on how well predators are able to control CWD. So really, this is something that needs more field research. Of course, there are going to be multiple and continuous invasions of chronic wasting disease into this system. And here we kind of looked at an event in isolation. And in reality, there are multiple CWD hosts and predator species. But in general, I think that our results are conservative because adding additional predators would likely increase the potential for predator-associated disease control, not decrease it. And then one issue that some people talk about is the ability for prions to pass through the GI tract of predators and scavengers, which could have the potential to spread CWD on the landscape. So for example, in this photo, this is an elk carcass by an elk killed by wolves. And there's a coyote, there's ravens. There are many types of scavengers in this system. But we don't really know much about this. And in general, I think that the benefits of predators selectively removing infectious prey outweigh this potential issue. But again, we don't know much about it. And then in reality, maintaining high enough predator densities could be really challenging. And this is, of course, mostly due to humans and human activities, hunting, management, landscape changes. These are how we manage both the prey and the predator species. So what are plausible predator numbers in the greater Yellowstone might not be plausible everywhere. Okay, so I want to kind of summarize what I think are the most important types of data to be collecting, particularly in the GYE, but not limited to the GYE. And these aren't necessarily new ideas, but just to kind of bring it all together here. So of course, continue monitoring the host population and continue monitoring the predator populations. So population dynamics, demographics, survival, cause-specific mortality, and then the predation habits, like I talked about. So continue with all of this as we move into kind of trying to understand the effects of CWD in this system. And then what's really important is the need for understanding predation habits with respect to chronic wasting disease. And so we really need to be able to test poor quality or very small amounts of tissue for chronic wasting disease. So on this picture on the top left, this is going to a bull elk carcass that was killed by wolves. And you can see there's just very little remaining. There's very little tissue left. And so getting samples from these predator killed carcasses is really challenging. And so if we were able to improve the quality of those sorts of tests, that is really necessary to know if predators are removing infected individuals at a greater rate than healthy individuals. And then of course, we need to understand baseline prevalence in the host population. So basically across North America, we are studying chronic wasting disease from hunters and harvest. So what happens is a hunter goes out, they kill a deer or an elk, and then they submit the head or submit a sample to the state agency. And so now we have information about CWD on that animal, as well as data that the hunter provides. And so this is really how we track chronic wasting disease in most situations. But we can't do that in Yellowstone or in Grand Teton in the GYE because there's no hunting in the park. And so instead, individuals are live captured. Tests used to be quite invasive for chronic wasting disease on live captured individuals, but now an ear punch just came out, which is pretty cool. And that is potentially a much better way to be testing these individuals for chronic wasting disease. Now, it would just be best if we didn't have to live capture. It would save money, it would save time. And so two ways we might be able to avoid live capture, but still track CWD is by testing environmental samples. So collecting soil that might have urine or feces or clay that prions tend to bind to and testing that. Or by grouping samples, so collecting fecal samples from maybe an entire herd and testing those simply to see if we can detect chronic wasting disease. Is it here or is it not? And this would cut down on time and effort. And we would like samples, of course, to be representative, but in general, we just need a lot of samples. It's really hard to detect chronic wasting disease in those early stages of invasion. Of course, like I said, the best option would be some type of experiment or natural experiment the best we can. At the very least, some sort of control sites that we can compare to the GYE. But really, if we could stratify different types of sites and monitor the effects of predation and of hunting pressure and chronic wasting disease, that would be the best situation. And then there is a lot of work going on to advance our understanding of chronic wasting disease outside of this system. And what I mentioned before, what I think is important is understanding transmission a bit better, especially in wild cervids. I'm including the infectious dose and being able to get better R0 estimates. And R0 is the basic reproduction number of a pathogen. So it's kind of a lot, but it's a very complicated system. Okay, so I wanted to end on something that is going to be exciting for everyone to be watching over the next decade. And these are systems where CWD infected cervid populations are colliding with wolves on the landscape. So these could provide some of those interesting comparisons in terms of management, predator effects, and disease dynamics. So we can start here in the Midwest. In Minnesota and Wisconsin, we have wolves expanding their range to the south and chronic wasting disease in white-tailed deer spreading to the north. There are some CWD positive deer in the north, mostly in deer farms, where these ranges overlap a little bit. But once these populations naturally move and come together, it's going to be interesting to see how and if wolves affect chronic wasting disease in wild deer. And then, of course, we have Colorado. CWD is endemic in wild mule deer and elk, and it has been for decades. Wolves are going to be reintroduced into Colorado in the next 3 years. So the big question is, will wolves reduce chronic wasting disease in these infected herds? I'm going to circle back to this in a second. Then we have the GYE, like I discussed today, where chronic wasting disease is newly invading in deer and elk. By natural movement, these hosts are bringing it closer to Yellowstone from essentially all sides, and the predator population is well established here. So this provides a really interesting comparison, I think, with Colorado. So essentially, the GYE is the opposite situation. So we have wolves established and the disease being introduced, whereas in Colorado, we have endemic chronic wasting disease and the wolves are being reintroduced. And we might not expect these systems to behave the same way. And in fact, I don't expect them to behave the same way. And a couple of reasons for that. One is that there is a much larger predator guild in the GYE than there is in Colorado that might impact CWD dynamics by predation on those hosts. And then the second is environmental reservoirs, which I didn't really touch on a lot today, but CWD can last in the environment for decades. And some of these reservoirs might occur in Colorado because it's been endemic for so long. And those reservoirs likely don't occur at the same spatial extent or potentially the same concentration of prions in the GYE. And then finally, we have Scandinavia, and in particular, Norway, where wolves and CWD infected reindeer both occur, and moose as well, but to a lesser extent. Both of these species are highly managed. It might be considered extreme compared to what we have in the US and especially in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. So CWD was detected in reindeer here in 2016, and an entire herd of 2,000 reindeer were culled. And then unfortunately, it was rediscovered again just recently. So now we know that this cull was unsuccessful in permanently removing CWD. The wolf population is kept very low. It's about 100 wolves for the entire country. So this system is really operating under a lot more human control than what we have in the US. So this could provide an interesting comparison. And I want to just end by saying, I think we're at a really interesting time looking at this really wide scale disease problem in wildlife that has multiple different hosts and a lot of different pressures acting on it that might change what the dynamics that we're seeing in these different systems. So current conditions make it possible, I think, for us to work together across these sites and tease apart the relative impacts of hunters and predators, and then environmental reservoirs and direct transmission. So including who's acquiring infection from whom, which we don't have a great understanding of. So hunters, no doubt, are a very large force on the landscape. There are millions of hunters and millions of deer and elk killed every year, but hunters and chronic wasting disease infected cervids really are overlapping everywhere. So it's very hard to understand their effects. This is some of my postdoc work. And then predators, which I just touched on, and all these different locations that we can be watching going into the future, and different transmission pathways, which are not super well understood. So teasing apart these relative impacts on chronic wasting disease dynamics, I think is really the way forward, and working together across these different sites. So with that, I just want to say thank you, and thank you for having me, and Jack Raby for inviting me. And I am happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Ellen, for a really fascinating and timely talk with how CWD has been progressing, and especially with how some of the predator management strategies have been progressing as well. So we do have a couple questions in the chat, but I figured I would open it up first to any brave souls who might want to unmute themselves and ask Ellen a question directly.
Hi there, Eric Mulvar with Western Watersheds Project. The question I have, or one of my questions is a test and cull approach really feasible as a means to eliminate or even reduce CWD in heavily forested, rugged country like that found in the Yellowstone ecosystem?
No, no, no. So yeah, I listed that as just, what has been done. That has been done in some places. It's extremely costly in terms of time and money, and capturing all these animals and then testing them. And if they're positive, going back out and capturing the same individuals again to remove them. No, it's not very feasible. And I don't think any area that I'm aware of actually really employs that as their main management strategy.
Hey, Ellen, this is Mike Samuel from Wisconsin. Hi, I have a couple of questions. There are at least 2 or 3 published examples of cougars and deer systems, which show high prevalence of CWD, as well as pretty severe population impacts.
Mm-hmm.
How do those results compare with your model predictions? And then the second question is related to elk behavior, which I know you sort of are not dealing with, but if wolves, for example, concentrate elk into bigger groups and there's direct transmission, are we really doing a good thing there?
Yeah, I think those are great questions. So I'll start with the first question. So in case people don't know, there have been a couple of studies out of Colorado where we do know that cougars have a higher preference. They're selecting CWD infected mule deer at a greater rate than uninfected mule deer. So specifically, I'm thinking of the paper Miller et al. 2018. And in that paper, they found that infected mule deer were killed at about 3 times higher rate than uninfected. And so how that relates to these modeling results, I just don't think that's a high enough selection. And it could be due to a few things. Maybe there are other prey that they are preying on in that system. And so maybe they don't need to kill as many deer. It could also be a factor of cougar density. So those ballpark estimates I gave for density and kill rates and selection, the Colorado system is probably not meeting all of those criteria in terms of the cougar deer system. And then I will add, like I said, this is a single predator prey model. So it is probably a simplified version of what's actually going on. So hopefully that answers your question. I think the biggest thing is that those reported selection rates are not great enough from what we found in this model.
What about the Wyoming studies?
I would need to look back for those exact numbers.
DeVivo's and Dave Edmonds studies, I think both have pretty intense cougar predation as well. Well, I don't know what intensity would be required. I think the data is there in those studies that you might be able to look at them as well.
Yeah, so that's a good point to be looking at those data. So I'm not sure on the numbers for Colorado, but I would say for Wyoming, for Wyoming, but for Colorado, what they've reported is simply just not high enough selection on those infected individuals.
I can chime in real quick on that. This is Dave Edmonds. Don't look into my work. We didn't have very much cougar predation in whitetails, but definitely look at Malia DeVivo's work in mule deer. And I would also suggest the lions and prions and deer demise paper of Mike Miller showed really high cougar predation rates with maintaining high CWD prevalence.
Yeah, so that's that 2000. That's what I was just referring to, that 2008 paper where the selection. I just don't believe the selection rate was high enough. And exactly like you mentioned, where we have seen cougars and mule deer overlap and CWD, we're not seeing great control of chronic wasting disease in those areas. So yeah, there is something that's definitely different there in terms of either its kill rate, density, or selection. That's what I would hypothesize.
Okay, thank you.
And then
we also know that wolves are coursing predators versus pouncing predators, and far more selective in because of that.
yes, and in these systems, I mean, we're not being able to compare to wolves because these are what they're mentioning, the cougar deer systems. But and then to get to your second question, yeah, I think that's great. I didn't include anything about behavior in this model in terms of how prey are aggregated and if that changes with predators on the landscape, and that might then therefore change transmission dynamics and then the effect of predators. It's quite complicated. I think it's a great question. I think it's something to be looking for in the future. And I think in the GYE, one place where we could kind of look at that scenario is by looking at the feed grounds in Wyoming, where we do know that elk are congregating at greater than natural densities in the winter. And if people are unfamiliar, this is where elk are fed primarily to keep cattle and elk from commingling. And so I think that would be a way to kind of look at that aggregation in the GYE, and that's a great point. Yeah.
Eric Odell, you have your hand raised. Did you want to go ahead and ask yours?
Yeah, I do. Thanks. And Ellen, thanks for the presentation. Really, really good. I'm Eric Odell. I'm with the Colorado Parks and Wildlife, and we'll be the ones doing the reintroduction. We get questioned quite a bit about what the role of wolves will be on CWD. And so I'm just curious to how you would respond to what degree of certainty can you state that wolves will or will not influence the extent or magnitude of CWD throughout Western Colorado?
I'm going to just avoid any specific numbers. So I'm just going to say that right off the bat. Yeah, so this study wasn't, specifically designed to be comparing the Colorado system and the GYE. But I've also been asked that question many, many times. In general, we can't really speak on specifics. There is no empirical data from the GYE system or, from Colorado. You don't have wolves yet. So there's no empirical data to really be looking at this. I will say a couple things just to, not leave you hanging. So environmental transmission is believed to play a much larger role later on in the epidemic when deer and elk have been depositing these prions in the environment, and then those prions in the environment are serving as a source for new infections. There's probably more in terms of a reservoir in Colorado versus the GYE. And so for that reason, I would not expect these systems to behave the same. So if a wolf were to, kill an infected elk, and that infected elk therefore couldn't transmit, well, if susceptible elks are picking up cases from the environment, it's a little bit decoupled. So we have our transmission and our predation a little bit decoupled in that respect. And so that's not necessarily an answer. I think that predators are one piece to the puzzle. Human management, regulations, prey density, prey behavior, all those things are part of it. And I think that predators are one piece to the puzzle. So, what I would say is we know predators remove prey that are in worse body condition. And like we just mentioned, we know that cougars are removing CWD positive mule deer at greater rates than uninfected mule deer. And so, the potential is absolutely there. And I would suspect that something that we would see at least some effect. It's going to take, a few years, a decade.
Yeah. Thank you. Sure. Thank you.
So it does look like we are right at 1 o'clock, but maybe I'll go to the chat, get a question or two in. There are quite a handful more questions.
Yeah, I'm happy to take a few more questions. Yeah.
Yeah, and whatever we don't get to, maybe I can put you in touch with the people who asked those questions after the fact. So first question from Mike Phillips. Do you have any thoughts on the zoonotic potential of CWD?
Yeah, that is a good question. So we do know, of course, that most transmission is happening between individuals of the same species. So deer to deer, elk to elk, that is where most of our CWD transmission is occurring. And there are what's called transmission barriers between different species. So what that means is that if that misfolded prion was to enter a different species, then it would be less likely to spur that protein misfolding in that host of that different species. So there are absolutely barriers. That's why we just don't see CWD spreading to all wildlife right now. That's not to say it can't occur. We haven't seen it yet. I would just say in general, for people that are worried about that, to be absolutely submitting your samples from hunting to your state agency for testing, and not consuming meat until you know that that animal is negative. I would always just play it safe in these types of situations. I'm not sure what else I can say specifically about zoonoses, but it's not been reported for CWD, but it's in the same family as mad cow disease, so there could be potential.
And then a question from Emily Almberg. Can you model the impacts of predators on the control of endemic disease versus controlling the invasion of CWD? I think you started to touch on this a little bit, or to have predictions for using increases in predators as a reactionary tool to the discovery of CWD in an area that may not currently have high predator density.
Hi, Emily. Yeah, that's a great question. So I'm just going to, in general, stray away from giving any advice on management. But yeah, so those three things I mentioned, predator densities, their kill rates, and their selection for infected prey, those are really key. We can't manipulate most of those things, right? We can't manipulate their selection. We can't manipulate their kill rates. So what can we manipulate? Their density. And their density is essentially another measure of kill rate, right? Because if you have more individuals, then the total number of prey that are removed is going to increase. So because that is what we can manipulate, I would say, yes, that is our best shot at having some sort of management of predators with the goal of having an effect on CWD, because that's really what we have. So I would say yes in terms of that. And then modeling endemic versus introduction. Yeah, that's a great idea. Obviously, it's not what I did here. I would expect the results to be different, again, because CWD is mostly transmitted in a frequency dependent manner. I think that there would be differences once we have a baseline high prevalence versus having this introduction of CWD into the system. So yeah, I think that's a great thing to do moving forward. Yeah.
Awesome. I think we'll finish it with one final question. I think it's a good kind of closing place. Kyle Smith asks, have you done any research into potential messaging and communication with hunters and stakeholders or general public on some of this research?
So I personally have not, no. Yeah, I think it's tough to say anything definitive at the moment. So it's also not my job. Like I do research on this. So I'm not someone, out there advocating for changes in policy personally. Although I do think, like I said, I do think that predators will have a positive impact. Even if it's not as great as what my model shows, I do think that predators will have a positive impact on reducing chronic wasting disease in this system. So I specifically haven't done anything on that. This work, like I said, is currently in review. And so hopefully once it's published and it's out there, it is used appropriately by others in a way to maybe inform certain management decisions. Yeah, so.
Great. Well, thanks again, Ellen. This was a really great talk and I think a good conversation to wrap up the semester. So thank you everyone who's joined today and throughout the semester, and we look forward to seeing you all in the fall.